To have this conversation, I'm excited to welcome into our studio Andrea Brandley. She is a senior education analyst for the Kem C Gardner Policy Institute. Andrea, welcome to the show.
Thanks so much for having me. I'm happy to be here.
And in our virtual studio is Christine Cook Fairbanks, our education policy fellow here at Sutherland. Christine, thanks for joining us.
Glad to be back. Thank you.
Well, I wanted to talk to both of you because, Andrea, you have a great new report from the Gardner Institute that sort of dives into this data and sort of has elevated this issue to a statewide priority in terms of maybe some concerning statistics about the literacy rates here in Utah for our K-12 education population. I want to start off because this was something that the governor talked about in the State of the State address. So I want to share a brief excerpt that this is what the governor had to say in his State of the State address.
Nearly half of our third graders are not reading at grade level, and too many of those children never catch up. That should concern us because reading is how people learn to think and govern themselves. A society that cannot read cannot reason together. And when reasoning breaks down, power rushes in to fill the void. Our goal is this: every child reading well, early, and with confidence. That means high standards and individualized support for struggling readers. Literacy is a policy choice. It means families, schools, and the state pulling in the same direction. Literacy is moral infrastructure, and if we want our children to grow up and live free, purposeful lives, we must give them a strong foundation today.
Again, that's Governor Spencer Cox in his most recent State of the State address. Andrea, the language of moral infrastructure really stood out to me, that the governor essentially saying this actually is really essential for the state of Utah. So I give all of that context. I'd love to just hear you kind of give an overview for our audience, talk about your new report, what prompted the Gardner Institute to commission this report, and what did you find? What do we need to know?
Yeah, so thanks for that introduction. We, as the governor mentioned, we see that only about half of third graders are reading on grade level, and those rates are really similar when you look at kindergartners, first graders, second graders. And while we've seen a little bit of improvement over the last 5-ish years, we still remain below pre-pandemic levels for every grade besides kindergarten. So we do see, some significant reading challenges in our state. And, speaking to what the governor spoke to as well, there is so much data on the critical importance of literacy, particularly from a young age. So if you look at, how does reading proficiently by third grade relate to a whole host of outcomes later on in life, we see that students are about 4 times more likely not to graduate high school if they're not reading proficiently by third grade, based on a national study. We also see that students are much more likely to have stronger long-term employment outcomes, higher wages, all of these things that we kind of see as helping them to live successful lives as adults, participate more in these civic engagement type things. So it really does show in the research that it's a pretty critical component for development and for our students to grow into adults that we want to see, that are contributing to society, that are living, happy, healthy lives. And we also see, I think, something that's kind of critical is that the research really shows that nearly all children can learn to read. So sometimes we face criticisms that, some children, based on their background or based on their circumstance, maybe it's just not in the cards for them. And the research really doesn't bear that out. We see over and over again that when students are given this systematic intentional support, that they are able to learn to read at fairly high levels. So I think that that's, kind of a hopeful finding to say that this is something that we can work on and we can improve through time. I will also mention that this is not just a Utah problem. We see similar numbers nationally where about half of our kids are really kind of struggling to meet that benchmark. So something to be worked on here in Utah, and hopefully maybe we can lead out in the nation.
What is your sense in the evidence or in your paper as far as why is this metric the way that it is? I mean, is this, you mentioned that we're still below pre-pandemic levels. Is this still just lingering effects because of the pandemic, Or is there something kind of more structural going on that we need to pay attention to?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I do think that the pandemic definitely influenced things, but even the rates prior to the pandemic were sub 60%. So we still saw fairly low literacy rates prior to that. I think that literacy, particularly early literacy, is a complex topic when you think about what leads to a student being able to read by third grade. So of course, what happens in school in kindergarten, first and second is critically important. But we also see that the most rapid brain development is actually happening from ages 0 to 5. So before students even enter the school system. So as far as, causes and what can help students learn to read at a higher level, I think it really starts very, very early. And the more interactions that very young children can have with a caregiver, where they're having conversations back and forth with them, they're being read to on a regular basis, they're being sung to and told stories to, really is like a critical component of their brain developing in a way so that they are ready for that more formal instruction when school starts. And then, of course, we have also seen kind of across the nation big pushes in changes to the way that we approach literacy instruction. And I think that that's something that's been happening in Utah already. We had a bill passed in 2022 that really focused on teacher professional development, making sure we're using really strong evidence-based instruction in schools. So it's kind of, a big combination of trying to make sure that we have those really early interventions in place, along with making sure we have really strong tier 1 instruction and then supports following that if needed.
Andrea, one thing that comes to mind for me too is because we've had so much discussion in the state in recent years and really around the country about a growing education choice landscape with a lot of parents, maybe being more interested in or taking greater advantage of different forms of schooling and education for their kids. How does the data in your report sort of account for that? We have traditional K-12 district schools, charter schools, homeschools, private schools. I mean, Christine could probably go down the list of all the different kinds of things we have in Utah now that's been growing in recent years. I guess, what does the data cover? What does it not cover? What do people need to know if they're looking at this data, wondering where any one particular type of schooling fits in?
Yeah, that's a great question. So this particular report covers our public schools, which includes both charter schools and traditional district schools. And really, if you look at districts, across districts, we see proficiency rates ranging from 30% to like 70%, just above 70%. This is not in the report, but I do have data for charter schools as well, and it shows an even larger range, which makes sense because we're looking at an individual school level rather than across a full school district. But it ranges from roughly 15% all the way up to nearly 90% across charter schools. And if you look at individual district schools, you see similar trends. So really, what I think we see the most is that there's significant variation across all types of schools. So some schools have pretty high rates of literacy, some schools have much lower rates of literacy. And we see that this does correlate with economic disadvantage. So if a school is serving a larger population of students who come from an economically disadvantaged background, then they're more likely to have a larger share of their students that are not reading proficiently. But we also see schools that I guess I would say are bucking the trend. So they do serve a large share of economically disadvantaged students, and their literacy rates are still above the state average. So I guess I would say, it really varies from school to school, and I would suggest looking at the literacy rates of individual schools. That data is available to the public. And as far as, district versus charter, we really see a range across both, and the average is fairly similar. I wish I could. I can't really speak to private schools and homeschools. The data is just not readily available. But hopefully we can, put some things in place that will help improve literacy outcomes regardless of the schools that our students choose to attend.
Christine, I want to get your take because Andrea mentioned some of the legislative efforts in the past. We're having this conversation in the middle of Utah's 2026 general legislative session, and I know this is a big topic on Utah's Capitol Hill. In fact, I think in a previous recent episode with you, kind of previewing education policy at the legislature, you made the comment that there are more bills on education than probably any other policy issue. So this is a big deal to lawmakers here in Utah. Can you kind of give us the latest on what's going on in sort of the education reform conversation here in Utah, especially as it relates to literacy? What should we be thinking about? What should we be talking about as a state if we look at these numbers in Andrea's report from Gardner Institute and say, how do we fix this? How do we make this better?
Yeah, so the heavyweight bill that was, much anticipated is SB 241, early literacy, and that went public last week. It actually passed out of the Senate Education Committee on Friday. And this is really building on, Andrea was talking about a bill that passed a few years ago. It's kind of building on that. I think the idea is that we've seen very modest progress. We're very unsatisfied with where we're at as a state. And so it's time to accelerate. And this bill focuses heavily on student interventions specifically. And so it continues this testing structure, a cadence, and so we can better assess where a student is in that whole K through 3 space. And then if a student is below benchmark, um, they can now have this specialized individual reading plan, and that's a big focus of the bill. And this is something that teachers and parents and maybe a reading specialist would work on and create for students. There is a list of interventions that you could use for a student, but that really is the focus. If you've followed some of the success stories of Mona Elementary, it has some similar features to that, where they really zeroed in on individualizing for students. So, and also, this bill focuses on making sure that training is also really strong. There's a big ask for money for paraprofessionals because they are a huge piece to this as well. Um, so I think that's the piece. I mean, a controversial piece of the bill is third grade retention, right? So if by the time you get to third grade, you're not at benchmark, then they hold you back, right? This is something that um, I think there's legitimate concerns and discussion about it, whether or not this would be something that could stigmatize a student and make a situation worse. At the same time, it's a really strong incentive to get a team around that student and make sure that they don't get there. And of course, I mean, if you're following the discussion, everyone is reiterating the same point. We really don't want to get to that intervention, right? So hopefully doing everything you can. In fact, there's an option to even look at retention in the earlier grades. So maybe kindergarten, right? And if you kind of see some of these struggles there. So, and even there can be some exceptions or, excuse me, when we're talking about third grade, if a student's not at benchmark, there can be some exceptions or some good cause reasons why you might be able to show that they need to move on to fourth grade anyways. But I think that the goal of this again is to focus on the individual. I think that's a good thing. I think because there's been so much anticipation around this bill and work on it, I think it has a high likelihood of passage. So
Christine, maybe one quick follow up on that, and then Andrea, I'd love to kind of hear some of your thoughts as well, as far as any other key things from your report that people need to know about, and kind of if you were to give kind of one big thing for Utah voters, Utah policymakers to take away from this to inform how they move forward. I want to get your take on that. But real quick, Christine, on the policy front, again, sort of as just a layman observer of this stuff, it seems like most of the momentum around our education policy reform conversations as a nation in recent years have been focused a lot on education choice. We've talked a lot about on this show how states around the country, really since 2020 or so, since the pandemic, there's been a very dramatic increase in those kinds of programs. And I think that's great. I love education choice. I think it's essential. Choice and options for parents is really important. But is there any risk that we are sort of not giving enough attention to things, sort of those core foundational things like literacy, maybe basic math skills? I mean, sort of these core educational benchmarks that can happen constructively in a variety of different learning settings. But I guess what I'm asking is this a needed sort of refocusing of the education reform conversation broadly? Not that we ignore or stop doing everything else we've been doing, but just sort of elevating or maybe re-elevating the importance of things like literacy. Is that sort of hey, guys, let's remember, this is actually what education is all about. We can't lose sight of this.
It's certainly. And I think that actually both are happening at the same time. So choice has been growing, but I also think awareness of literacy has been growing at the same time. Specifically, the science of reading has, kind of taken center stage. And so, it's just the background. There's kind of been this battle of whole language learning, to reading instruction versus the more traditional or science of reading, like phonics and comprehension and things like that. Um, and then there have been some other pieces that have, kind of stoked the fire a little bit. There was a podcast in 2022 that spread awareness around the fact that kind of the whole language approaches were failing our students. Um, and then there's a really well-known uh, example, Mississippi Miracle. That state brought up their reading scores from like 49th to ninth in about a decade, a little over a decade. And they really focused on science of reading. By the way, they used third grade reading retention or grade retention for those that weren't reading at grade level. So a lot of people look to those. And and there's much more than that, but they have created this, I guess, kind of consensus around the fact that, yes, we need to focus on reading. Yes, there is a right way. In a sense, there's a data-backed way to approach this. So I think both have been kind of growing alongside each other. I think that's great. As parents are making choices, you also want them to be aware of what good choices are, right? And so as they're seeking if they're going to do a home-based curriculum, like be aware of what this discussion is, and hopefully the resources grow as well.
Andrea, final thoughts as far as anything else from your report that you think is really important for folks to kind of remember and take away from, and especially for the policy conversation as we're having conversations here in Utah's legislature. Obviously, this issue is important nationally, but are there any kind of key things that if you were speaking to elected officials, you would say, hey, this is like the one big thing you need to remember and help guide your reform conversations? What would be top of mind for you?
Yeah, so I think that I'm grateful to have kind of the policy summary. I think that policy is a critical step, a critical first important step, and really helps as a state for all of us to get on the same page and see where we want to go and what is our goal. I also think it's very clear in the research, both of Mississippi and of other states, that implementation is what drives results. So I think that it's really critical to have all of these frameworks in place and to make sure that we have the resources we need and the interventions and the reading plans, and then really making sure that this is trickling down to school districts and trickling down to individual schools, and then ultimately trickling down to individual classrooms, right? Because no matter what our policy is, if we don't have a teacher in the classroom or a teacher in the home or wherever the teacher is, that's really following this science of reading-based approach, then, it doesn't get to the end of the road. It doesn't get to the student. So I think that that's just, one of the bigger findings of the research is just to say, hey, this really kind of takes everyone, and it takes time, and it takes us all continuing down the same path for a while before we get there. And then I also just think, so the Clark and Christine Ivory Foundation is actually who reached out to us to do this particular report, which I first just want to thank them for doing that, but also want to say that I think that that's just a signal that we have, strong business and community leaders who are also very invested in this issue, which is helpful to say, hey, look, we're going to look at this from a school's perspective, from a community and business perspective, from a policy perspective, and the more we can, kind of all get on the same page, on the same boat, rowing in the same direction, I think the bigger difference we likely can make.
Well, we need to take a quick break. We're going to continue the conversation with some other voices in the education world here in Utah. I just want to underscore, Andrea, that last point you made, that it takes everyone. I mean, I've worked in governor's administrations in the past and worked on State of the State addresses. The fact that this got into Governor Cox's State of the State is a big deal. And the fact that the other folks you're talking about are involved, I just love that idea. It takes everyone, and this is really important for the state of Utah, and I'm confident we'll get it right. So thank you for your research and for sharing your findings here with us on Defending Ideas.
Of course. Thanks for having me.
Thanks for watching that clip of Defending Ideas. For the full conversation, click the link in the description, and make sure to like and subscribe wherever you get your shows.